Grace never imagined that her quiet life would turn into a battleground. In the sleepy neighborhood of Santa Teresa, where the days were slow and predictable, no one expected terror to strike so close to home. But lurking in the shadows was a danger that would test the bond between a woman and her dog, a bond forged through love, trust, and second chances. This was no ordinary dog. Rex, her loyal German shepherd, had a past as dark as the night that was about to descend on them. Before we dive into this story, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay updated with our latest stories. Now, let's get started. Years ago, Grace found Rex in a shelter, his body trembling, his eyes hollow with fear. She didn't see a broken animal, she saw a soul begging for hope. Without hesitation, she brought him home, her voice firm yet tender as she said, "You're safe now, Rex. From this day forward, we're a team." And Rex, as if understanding every word, devoted himself to protecting her with unwavering loyalty. Every morning, Grace and Rex walked the same streets. She greeted her neighbors with warm smiles, and Rex stayed close, his sharp eyes scanning their surroundings. But this morning, something felt off. Rex, usually calm and composed, seemed uneasy. His ears twitched, his nose darted toward invisible scents, and his body tensed as if bracing for a threat. "Rex, what's the matter, boy?" Grace asked, her voice tinged with concern as she stroked his neck. Rex didn't respond with his usual calm gaze. Instead, his eyes carried a message, one of urgency, of warning. It was as if he knew that their peaceful life was about to be shattered. As Grace and Rex continued their walk, the world around them seemed quieter than usual. The lively hum of Santa Teresa's morning routine had dulled, replaced by an uneasy stillness. Rex's sharp ears twitched, and he stopped abruptly, his posture stiff, his nose pointing towards something unseen. Grace glanced down at him, puzzled. "What's wrong, Rex?" she asked, her voice soft but tinged with concern. Following Rex's intense gaze, she noticed two men standing at the edge of the street. One was tall and broad-shouldered with a smug, self-assured look, while the other, shorter and thinner, appeared nervous, his eyes darting around like a cornered animal. They weren't familiar faces, and the way they lingered made her uneasy. Unbeknownst to Grace, Marco and Carlos had been watching her for days. Marco smirked as he observed the old woman and her dog. "Easy pickings," he murmured to Carlos. "An old lady and her mutt? No one will even notice." Carlos hesitated, his gaze lingering on Rex. "That dog, something's off about it. Look at the way it's watching us," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Marco chuckled darkly. "It's just a dog. Handle it, and the rest will be simple." Rex let out a low growl, his body bristling as he kept his eyes fixed on the men. Grace tugged gently at his leash. "Rex, stop it. You're scaring me," she said, her voice trembling slightly as she looked around. The men didn't approach, but their presence felt like a shadow following her every step. As they reached her small house nestled at the edge of Santa Teresa, Grace couldn't shake the unease building in her chest. Her trembling hands locked the door, the metallic click echoing louder than usual in the stillness. "It's fine now, boy," she murmured to Rex, trying to convince herself more than him. But Rex remained on edge, standing vigil by the door, his growl steady, his eyes piercing the darkness outside. Across the street, Marco and Carlos melted into the shadows, their predatory gaze fixed on Grace's home. Marco turned to Carlos, his voice cold and deliberate. "Tonight we finish this. That dog won't be a problem." Carlos nodded reluctantly, casting one last uneasy glance at the house. Grace sat in her worn armchair, trying to steady her racing heart. Rex's stance by the door offered her some comfort, but the memory of those men lingered, gnawing at her thoughts. Nightfall settled over Santa Teresa, casting long shadows that crept across the cobblestone streets. Grace sat in her modest living room, the hum of her old clock breaking the silence. She tried to lose herself in a worn paperback, but the weight of Rex's steady growl by the door kept pulling her back to reality. His posture was tense, his ears alert, and his eyes locked on the darkened windows. Outside, Marco and Carlos crouched in an alley across the street. Marco lit a cigarette, the faint glow of the ember illuminating his smirk. "We've waited long enough," he muttered, his voice low but firm. "The old lady's probably asleep by now. We'll be in and out before she even knows what's happening." Carlos shifted uneasily, glancing toward Grace's house. "What about the dog?" he asked. Marco scoffed, flicking the cigarette to the ground. "It's just a dog, Carlos. I've handled worse." Unaware of their exact plans, Grace couldn't shake the uneasy feeling lingering in her chest. She closed her book and stood, peering out through the curtains. The street outside was quiet, too quiet. "You're acting like a fool," she muttered to herself, trying to dismiss the growing fear. But as her eyes landed on Rex, who hadn't moved from his vigil by the door, she couldn't ignore the tension that radiated from him. Then came a sound, a faint rustling outside, almost imperceptible but enough to make Rex's growl deepen. His fur bristled, and he stepped closer to the door. Grace froze, her breath catching in her throat. "What is it, Rex?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Marco and Carlos moved closer, their footsteps muffled against the soft earth. Marco gestured toward the side of the house. "We'll go around, check for an open window first," he instructed. Carlos hesitated but followed, his every step laden with doubt. Inside, Grace's fear was mounting. She grabbed her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed the number, but then stopped. What would she even say? That she felt scared without knowing why. Shaking her head, she set the phone down and turned to Rex. "It's nothing, boy. Probably just the wind," she said, though her words felt hollow even to her own ears. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from the side of the house, sending a jolt through Grace's body. Rex sprang into action, barking furiously as he lunged toward the noise. Grace's heart pounded as she reached for a heavy lamp from the table, clutching it tightly in her hands. The thud came again, followed by the unmistakable sound of a muffled voice. "Let's go!" Marco hissed, pulling Carlos back. "We'll come back later when things calm down." For now, they melted back into the darkness, their shadows disappearing into the night. Grace sank into her chair, Rex still growling by the door. The house was quiet again, but the silence felt heavier, as if it carried the weight of what was yet to come. "You knew, didn't you, Rex?" she murmured, stroking his head. His intense gaze remained fixed on the door, as though he was still guarding against an unseen threat. The clock struck midnight, and the quiet of Santa Teresa deepened. Grace lay in bed, her eyes wide open, unable to shake the unease that gripped her. Rex stood in the hallway, his frame tense, his ears perked toward the door. The room felt heavy, as if the air itself carried a warning. Outside, Marco and Carlos crept closer, their movements shrouded by the cover of night. "Quiet!" Marco hissed, gesturing for Carlos to follow him to the front door. The metallic sound of tools against the lock broke the stillness, sending a jolt through Rex. His growl rumbled low and dangerous, waking Grace with a start. "Rex, what is it?" she whispered, her heart pounding as she reached for her lamp. Before she could gather her thoughts, the front door crashed open, slamming against the wall with a force that echoed through the house. Grace's scream pierced the night as two shadowy figures stormed in. "Stay quiet, lady, and no one gets hurt," Marco barked, his voice sharp and menacing. Rex, however, didn't wait. With a ferocious snarl, he launched himself at Marco, his powerful jaws clamping down on the man's arm. Marco yelled in pain, dropping the metal rod he had been holding. "Get him off me!" Marco shouted, trying to shake Rex loose. Carlos stepped forward, brandishing a knife, but Rex turned, baring his teeth, forcing Carlos to stumble back. In the chaos, Grace gripped the lamp tightly and swung it with all her strength, striking Marco across the shoulder. The impact sent him staggering, but Rex wasn't done. He lunged again, driving Marco to the floor. Carlos, panicked, looked for an escape. "Marco, let's go!" he yelled, backing toward the door. But Marco, humiliated and furious, snarled. "Not yet!" He lunged for Grace, only to be blocked by Rex, who stood firm, his growl echoing through the room like a warning bell. The commotion was deafening, barking, shouting, the sound of furniture toppling as the struggle continued. Grace, though trembling, refused to back down. She reached for her phone, dialing the police with shaky hands. "Please hurry," she begged, her voice barely audible over the chaos. Realizing the tide had turned, Carlos pulled at Marco's arm. "We have to go! That dog's going to kill us!" Marco hesitated, his anger battling his fear, but the sight of Rex, still poised, still ready to fight, finally broke his resolve. Together, they bolted out the door, disappearing into the darkness. The room fell silent, save for Rex's heavy breathing. Grace collapsed into a chair, tears streaming down her face as she reached for her loyal companion. "You saved me, Rex," she whispered, her voice trembling with both fear and gratitude. Rex rested his head on her lap, his eyes still watching the door, ready for whatever came next. The distant wail of sirens broke the heavy silence that lingered in the aftermath of the fight. Grace sat frozen in her chair, clutching Rex's thick fur as tears streamed down her face. Her hands trembled, but her heart swelled with gratitude and disbelief. Rex, still panting heavily, refused to relax. His sharp eyes remained fixed on the door, his body a barrier between Grace and the darkness outside. Moments later, flashing red and blue lights illuminated the cobblestone street. 2 officers burst into the house, their weapons drawn. "Are you all right, ma'am?" one asked urgently, scanning the room. Grace could barely speak, her voice choked with emotion. They tried to hurt me, but Rex, he saved me," she managed to say, her trembling hand resting on Rex's head. As the officers secured the scene, Rex watched them carefully, his protective instincts still on high alert. Outside, Marco and Carlos were intercepted by another patrol unit just as they tried to flee the neighborhood. The officers quickly subdued them, their shouts drowned out by the commanding orders of law enforcement. Inside, the lead officer turned back to Grace. "You're lucky to have this dog," he said, kneeling to meet Rex's intense gaze. "He's a real hero." Rex responded with a low rumble, more alert than grateful, as if still guarding against unseen threats. Grace wiped her tears, her voice firmer now. "He's more than a hero," she said softly. "He's my family." The officers spent the next several minutes gathering Grace's statement. She recounted the terrifying events as best as she could, her voice shaking but steady. "If it weren't for Rex," she said, her words trailing off as she glanced at her loyal companion. The officer nodded, his face serious. "We'll make sure those men are brought to justice, but I recommend reinforcing your locks and installing an alarm system. They may try again." Grace nodded, a mixture of relief and lingering fear washing over her. "I'll do whatever it takes," she replied. As the officers prepared to leave, one turned to Rex and gave him an approving pat. "Good boy," he said with a smile. But Rex barely reacted, his focus still on the shadows outside. Grace knew he wouldn't rest until he was certain the danger was gone. That night, as the house finally fell silent, Grace sat beside Rex on the floor. "You're my protector, Rex," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Rex rested his head on her lap, his body relaxing for the first time since the attack. For a brief moment, the bond between them felt almost tangible, a silent reassurance that together, they could face anything. The days following the break-in were a whirlwind of change for Grace. What was once a tranquil home now felt like a battleground she was determined to secure. The locksmith arrived early the next morning, reinforcing every door and window with heavy-duty locks. She spared no expense installing a sophisticated alarm system, complete with motion sensors, surveillance cameras, and a direct connection to the local police station. At night, the faint blinking of the camera's lights reminded her that she was safer, but not entirely at ease. Rex, however, seemed to take on his new role as protector with unshakable resolve. Each morning, he circled the yard like a sentinel, his sharp eyes scanning every corner, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air for signs of danger. Neighbors passing by often paused to watch him, murmuring among themselves about his watchful demeanor. "He knows," one neighbor whispered. "That dog's not just guarding her, he's guarding all of us." By day, Grace busied herself with errands, though her steps felt heavier and more deliberate than before. The memory of that terrifying night was never far from her thoughts. Even the simple act of opening her front door sent a chill through her, though Rex always stayed close, his presence grounding her. News of Rex's bravery traveled quickly, and the small, tight-knit community of Santa Teresa rallied around Grace and her loyal companion. Neighbors who had once exchanged only polite nods now stopped by with words of admiration and support. Mrs. Clara, who lived a few houses down, arrived one afternoon with a basket of freshly baked cookies. "I heard about everything," she said, her voice warm but tinged with concern. "Rex is a hero. Truly, we're lucky to have him here." Grace smiled, her heart swelling with pride as she glanced at Rex. "He's always been my hero," she replied, her voice soft but resolute. Rex sat by her side, his posture proud but calm, his sharp eyes flicking toward the street as if still on duty. Despite the kind gestures and added security, Grace couldn't shake the feeling of unease that crept in with the setting sun. The shadows of her home, once comforting, now seemed to harbor unseen threats. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside, made her heart race. But when she looked at Rex, standing vigilant near the door, his gaze steady and unyielding, her fears eased, if only for a moment. It was clear to Grace that Rex wasn't just her protector, he was the beating heart of her home, the one constant that made her believe she could find peace again. The sun was setting over Santa Teresa when Grace heard a firm knock at her door. Rex, as always, was the first to react, positioning himself between Grace and the entrance, his ears perked and his body tense. Grace hesitated for a moment, then peered through the peephole. Standing on the porch was Officer Mateo, his familiar figure giving her a sense of reassurance. She opened the door cautiously. "Officer Mateo," she greeted, her voice steady but curious. "Is everything all right?" Mateo removed his hat and offered a small smile. "Miss Grace, I'm here on behalf of the department. We'd like to invite you and Rex to a ceremony at the station." Grace raised an eyebrow, her curiosity now mixed with a flicker of pride. "A ceremony?" she echoed. "Yes," Mateo continued. "Rex's actions that night were nothing short of extraordinary. The chief has decided it's only fitting to honor him with a medal for his bravery. We've already informed the local press. They're eager to share his story." Grace glanced down at Rex, who sat calmly by her side, his sharp eyes flicking between her and Mateo. It was as if he understood every word, though his expression remained composed and focused. Grace's hand rested lightly on his head, her heart swelling with emotion. "A medal?" she murmured, her voice soft with disbelief. Mateo nodded firmly. "What he did wasn't just about protecting you, Miss Grace. It was about embodying the loyalty and courage we all aspire to. The community sees him as more than a dog. They see him as a symbol of what it means to stand against fear." For a moment, Grace was overwhelmed. She thought back to the night she first brought Rex home from the shelter, trembling and frail. Now, he was not only her protector but also a beacon of hope for the entire neighborhood. "We'll be there," she said, her voice resolute. "Good," Mateo replied, tipping his hat again. "The ceremony is in 2 days at the station. I'll send someone to pick you both up if you'd like." "That won't be necessary," Grace replied with a small smile. "Rex and I will manage just fine." As Mateo left, Grace closed the door and leaned against it for a moment, her hand resting on Rex's head. "They're right about you, boy," she said softly. "You're extraordinary." Rex, ever stoic, simply nudged her hand with his nose, as if to remind her that his job wasn't done yet. The day of the ceremony arrived, and the atmosphere in Santa Teresa buzzed with anticipation. Grace stood in front of her mirror, adjusting the delicate scarf around her neck. She glanced down at Rex, who sat patiently by her feet, his calm demeanor masking the excitement she felt. "You ready, boy?" she asked softly. Rex responded with a slight wag of his tail, his sharp eyes watching her every move. The police station was bustling with activity. Outside, neighbors gathered, chatting excitedly about the hero dog. As Grace and Rex approached, the crowd parted, their whispers filled with admiration. "That's him," someone murmured. "That's the dog who saved her." Inside the station, the ceremony was held in a large hall decorated with banners and the emblem of the Santa Teresa Police Department. Officers in uniform lined the room, their expressions a mix of respect and pride. At the center of it all was a small podium, where the police chief stood waiting. As Grace and Rex walked in, the room erupted into applause. Grace felt her cheeks flush, but it was Rex who stole the show. Walking confidently by her side, his sleek black coat glistened under the lights, and his posture radiated strength and dignity. The police chief raised his hand, and the applause gradually quieted. "Today, we gather not just to honor a dog, but a hero," he began, his voice steady and commanding. "Rex's actions on that fateful night remind us all of the courage, loyalty, and instinct that define true bravery. He protected his owner, and in doing so, he inspired an entire community." The chief turned toward Rex, kneeling down to meet the dog's steady gaze. In his hands was a small, gleaming medal attached to a blue ribbon. "Rex, on behalf of the Santa Teresa Police Department and the community you've protected, we present this medal of bravery to you." As the chief placed the medal around Rex's neck, the room erupted into cheers. Grace's eyes filled with tears as she watched her loyal companion sit stoically, seemingly unfazed by the attention. "You deserve this, Rex," she whispered, her voice trembling with pride. After the ceremony, attendees lined up to meet Rex. Children reached out to pet him, their faces glowing with wonder. "He's a real hero," one little boy said, his voice filled with awe. Grace smiled warmly. "He's been my hero for years," she replied. Neighbors and officers alike stopped to shake Grace's hand, their words of gratitude pouring out. "You're lucky to have him," one officer said. Grace glanced at Rex, who was still sitting proudly, his medal gleaming under the lights. "I am," she replied. "But I think I'm the lucky one." As the event wound down, Grace and Rex stood by the door, taking in the moment. The weight of fear that had lingered since the attack felt lighter now, replaced by an overwhelming sense of pride and belonging. "You did good, boy," Grace said softly, stroking Rex's head. Rex looked up at her, his calm eyes filled with the silent promise he had always kept, to protect her, no matter what. That night, under a sky scattered with stars, Grace and Rex returned to their cozy home. The weight of the past days seemed to lift as they stepped onto the porch. Grace set down her purse and paused, looking out over the quiet streets of Santa Teresa. Everything felt still, peaceful, as if the world itself was taking a deep breath after all they had endured. Rex settled at her feet, the medal still hanging proudly around his neck, glinting faintly in the moonlight. Grace reached down, stroking his fur gently. "Rex," she murmured, her voice soft but steady. "You're not just my hero. You're my family. And with you by my side, I know we can face anything." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The kind of silence that brings comfort, not fear. The kind that reminds you of safety and home. Grace leaned back in her chair, her heart full of gratitude for the loyal companion who had stood by her through every challenge. As the night deepened, Rex rested his head on her lap, his body finally relaxed. But even in his calm, his sharp eyes occasionally flicked toward the street, as if to remind her that his duty to protect her was never truly done. Grace closed her eyes, feeling a warmth in her chest that she hadn't felt in weeks. It wasn't just relief, it was hope. For the first time since that terrifying night, she felt whole again, knowing that together, she and Rex had overcome what once seemed insurmountable. And as we reflect on their journey, let's not forget the incredible bond between a human and their loyal companion, a bond that can overcome even the darkest of times. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. Stay with us for more heartfelt and inspiring stories like this one. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.